Today, I invite you to explore one of the most impactful events recorded in the United States during the war. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know where these documented accounts reach and at what times of day or night. The metal buttons gleamed dully in the April sunlight, each one stamped with the letters U.S. The eagle insignia adorned the blue uniforms of men who not long before had been denied the right to wear them. It was 1865, and the tide of war had finally turned. As Confederate forces retreated south, a secret document from Richmond had crossed Union lines, one that would never appear in official Confederate records, one whose existence would be denied for decades to come. Hidden within filing cabinets at the War Department in Washington lay first-hand accounts that revealed the darkest practices of a desperate Confederate leadership. These documents spoke of systematic denial, calculated cruelty, and an unwritten policy regarding captured black Union soldiers, men who had once been enslaved, now wearing the uniform of the United States Army. Men whose very existence as soldiers represented everything the Confederacy had fought to prevent. When Benjamin Reynolds of the 29th Connecticut Colored Infantry was captured near Petersburg in March of 1865, his regiment had already lost 38 men. But these soldiers hadn't fallen in combat. The official records listed them as missing, a designation that concealed their true fate. Reynolds himself would later provide testimony about what actually happened to black soldiers who surrendered, testimony preserved in military archives but quickly classified after the war's conclusion. The 41st United States Colored Infantry, one of the units present at Appomattox during Lee's surrender, carried with them memories of comrades who never made it to that historic moment. Their colonel, Jonathan Bigelow, kept a leather-bound journal documenting the regiment's experiences. His April entries hinted at procedures not befitting civilized warfare, a euphemism for atrocities he could not bring himself to describe directly. The journal, microfilmed in 1943, was quietly deposited in the National Archives where it remained largely unexamined. By January of 1865, nearly 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army, approximately 10% of all Union forces. Their presence had transformed the nature of the conflict from a war to preserve the Union into a struggle for human freedom. Yet their service came at a terrible price, one deliberately obscured in post-war reconciliation narratives. The Confederate Congress had declared on May 1, 1863, that any captured black soldier and their white officers would be subject to execution for instigating servile insurrection. While officially this policy was rarely acknowledged in writing, dispatches between field commanders revealed its implementation was far more widespread than surviving records suggest. Lieutenant Thomas Matthews of the 8th United States Colored Heavy Artillery wrote to his wife on February 7, 1865, "Our men know what awaits them if captured. Many carry a single bullet in their breast pocket, a last resort should surrender become inevitable." The letter was intercepted by Confederate cavalry, annotated by an intelligence officer, and eventually made its way back to Union lines after Richmond fell. The intelligence officer's margin notes simply stated, "Evidence of Negro soldiers' understanding of their proper status if returned to the South." When Major William Stone of the 114th Infantry was tasked with debriefing escaped Union prisoners in February 1865, he documented disturbing patterns. His reports, filed with the Adjutant General's office, indicated that captured black soldiers were systematically separated from white prisoners and rarely appeared in official prisoner exchanges. Mortality among colored troops in Confederate captivity exceeds 70%, Stone wrote, compared to 30% for white enlisted men. The documentation was preserved in triplicate, with copies sent to the War Department, the headquarters of General Grant, and a sealed file personally requested by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. This third copy disappeared from archives in 1868 during post-war reorganization. Captain Samuel Howard was assigned to the burial detail at Annapolis, Maryland, where returned Union prisoners arrived from southern prison camps in early 1865. His ledger recorded the number of returning prisoners by regiment and race. The statistical disparity was so stark that Howard requested clarification from his superiors about how to record the figures. Am I to note the complete absence of returning colored troops as desertion, death, or simply unaccounted? He wrote on April 4th. The reply from the Quartermaster General's office instructed him to list them as missing, fate unknown. While Northern newspapers reported on Confederate treatment of black prisoners, the full extent remained classified by military authorities concerned about inflaming racial tensions during early Reconstruction. A memorandum from the office of General Ulysses S. Grant, dated May 9, 1865, expressed concern that public knowledge of systematic mistreatment of colored troops would severely complicate efforts at national reconciliation. Private Marcus Wilson, formerly enslaved in Georgia and serving with the 54th Massachusetts, witnessed the capture of 23 soldiers from his regiment near Charleston in early 1865. They were marched away separately from the white captives. He later testified to a military commission. None ever returned to Union lines or appeared on prisoner exchange rolls. Wilson's testimony was taken under oath, but filed away with thousands of similar accounts that would remain sealed for decades. The small wooden chest discovered in an abandoned Confederate headquarters at Danville, Virginia, contained dispatches marked for commanding officers only. Among them was a memorandum dated January 18, 1865, clarifying procedures for handling black prisoners. These men are not to be accorded standard prisoner of war protocols. Proper disposition is left to the discretion of field commanders, with the understanding that the Confederacy cannot recognize former slaves as legitimate military personnel. The document bore the initials of a high-ranking Confederate official, but was never officially acknowledged in post-war investigations. The records of Confederate prison camps revealed systematic disparities. At Cahaba Prison in Alabama, the January 1865 registration logs showed 174 white prisoners received from the Battle of Nashville, but not a single black soldier, despite Union reports that at least 47 black soldiers had been captured in the same engagement. Prison surgeon Ellis Thompson noted in his medical log that no colored prisoners required his services, an impossibility unless they had been diverted elsewhere before reaching the camp. In Richmond, as Confederate forces prepared to evacuate the city in April 1865, Clerk Edward Reynolds was ordered to burn selected documents from the War Department. Among them were files containing communications regarding the disposition of captured black troops. Reynolds, secretly harboring Union sympathies, managed to preserve fragments of these papers, which he later submitted to federal authorities. One partial document read, "The matter of captured Negro soldiers continues to present difficulties. Alternative arrangements should continue as previously established." The fragments were deemed too incomplete for use in post-war tribunals. James Montgomery, a white officer commanding the 3rd South Carolina Colored Infantry, wrote in a March 1865 report, "Our men fight with the knowledge that surrender means death or worse. They have seen their captured comrades return to us as corpses, bearing signs of treatment too barbaric to detail in official correspondence." Montgomery's report was deemed unnecessarily inflammatory by his superior officer and removed from the regimental record, though a copy survived in his personal papers discovered in 1941. The telegraph operator at the Union headquarters near Appomattox intercepted a Confederate message on April 7, 1865, just 2 days before Lee's surrender. The partially garbled transmission requested urgent instructions regarding colored prisoners currently held as Confederate forces retreated. No reply was ever recorded, and no black prisoners were documented among those released after the surrender. The telegraph log was preserved, but the entry was struck through with the notation "Transmission error, disregard," added in different handwriting. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bartholomew of the Provost Marshal's office was assigned to interview Confederate officers after the surrender at Appomattox. His confidential report, dated April 22, 1865, noted, "Several field-grade officers freely admitted that black prisoners rarely reached formal prison camps. When pressed on this matter, most claimed these troops were reassigned to labor details, but could provide no records of such assignments nor explain why these men never appeared on prisoner exchange lists." At Cold Harbor in 1864, the bodies of 7 black soldiers were discovered in a shallow grave behind Confederate lines when Union forces advanced. All bore gunshot wounds to the back of the head, despite having been captured during frontal assaults. The medical examiner's report was filed with Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt, but was later removed from the official record with a notation that it requires further verification before inclusion in war crime proceedings. No further investigation was documented. The final order issued by the Confederate War Department on April 2, 1865, as Richmond fell to Union forces, instructed field commanders to dispose of all sensitive documentation regarding special categories of prisoners. The order was intercepted by Union Signal Corps officers, but its significance wasn't recognized until weeks later, when investigators began searching for records of missing black soldiers that seemed to have vanished entirely from Confederate prison registers. As federal troops entered Richmond, they discovered partially burned documents in stoves throughout Confederate government buildings. Army Surgeon Malcolm Greene, assigned to gather medical records, preserved fragments of a memorandum regarding the proper handling of Negro captives. The document explicitly stated that such prisoners should not be entered into standard prisoner rolls, but instead be returned to appropriate status through expedited channels. Military investigators understood this as coded language for returning black soldiers to slavery or worse. In the chaos of Lee's retreat toward Appomattox, a dispatch case was abandoned by a Confederate courier near Farmville, Virginia. Inside was a letter dated April 6, 1865, from a field commander requesting instructions about 34 captured black artillerymen. "These men cannot be transported with our column, and local authorities refuse to accept responsibility for their detention. Urgent instructions requested." No reply was found, and no record of these 34 men ever appeared in prisoner logs or casualty reports on either side. The most damning evidence came from Confederate soldiers themselves. Private Thomas Garland of the 11th Virginia wrote to his brother on March 28, 1865, "Captured 2 Negro soldiers yesterday wearing federal uniforms. Captain had them removed from the prisoner column before we reached camp. When I asked where they were taken, he merely said, 'They've been dealt with according to our laws regarding armed slaves.'" The letter was intercepted by Union mail screeners, but deemed too sensitive for public release. Sergeant William Blackwood of the 37th North Carolina described witnessing the capture of several black soldiers near Petersburg in his diary entry of March 19, 1865. The following day he wrote, "The Negro prisoners from yesterday are gone this morning. When I inquired as to their whereabouts, Lieutenant Morris said only, 'Those weren't prisoners. They were property returned to proper legal status.'" The men laughed, but I confess I felt uneasy about the matter. The diary was found among Blackwood's effects when he was himself captured a week later. The Confederate camp ledger from a field headquarters near Dinwiddie Courthouse, dated March 31, 1865, contained a disturbing entry. Received from forward pickets 7 prisoners, white, to be transferred to rear detention facility, special handling implemented for 3 colored captives as per standing orders. No record of these 3 men ever appeared in any prison camp register. The ledger was seized by Union cavalry during the Appomattox campaign and submitted as evidence to the Bureau of Military Justice. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw had commanded the 54th Massachusetts, one of the first black regiments in the Union Army, until his death at Fort Wagner in 1863. His personal correspondence with other officers commanding black troops revealed their shared understanding of the dangers their men faced if captured. In a letter dated January 1863, Shaw wrote to a fellow officer, "We must impress upon our men the necessity of fighting to the last. For them, there can be no surrender." The warning proved prophetic, as Union records would later confirm. Dr. Isaiah Mitchell, a surgeon with the 26th United States Colored Infantry, documented in his medical journal what happened when 3 wounded men from his regiment were captured near Hatcher's Run in February 1865. 2 weeks later, their bodies were recovered during a Union advance. His clinical notes described, "Examination reveals that initial wounds were non-fatal." All 3 subjects show evidence of execution by firearm at close range post-capture. His report was forwarded to the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, but was classified and sealed until 1911. The evidence was overwhelming, yet systematically suppressed in the interest of post-war reconciliation. When Major General Carl Schurz conducted his tour of the South in the summer of 1865, he gathered extensive testimony about the treatment of captured black soldiers. His confidential report to President Andrew Johnson concluded, "The evidence suggests a widespread practice of executing colored troops upon capture or returning them to slavery despite their status as United States soldiers." Johnson reportedly instructed Schurz to remove these findings from his public report. By the summer of 1865, as Confederate armies surrendered and prisoners were exchanged, the disparity became impossible to ignore. Of approximately 40,000 black soldiers who served in theaters where combat with Confederate forces occurred, fewer than 1,000 were ever documented as having been held as prisoners of war. Military statistician Lieutenant Philip Garrison calculated that this represented a statistical impossibility unless alternative procedures were being implemented for these troops. His analysis was filed with the War Department, but never published. In June 1865, Union General Lew Wallace established a commission to investigate the disposition of missing black soldiers. The commission's work was abruptly halted in October when President Johnson's administration shifted focus to rapid reconciliation with former Confederate states. The partial findings, preserved in Wallace's personal papers, concluded, "There exists substantial evidence of widespread, systematic mistreatment of captured colored troops, including summary execution, return to slavery, or lethal neglect, amounting to de facto execution." The final toll would never be precisely calculated. Military records indicated that of the 180,000 black men who served in the Union Army, nearly 40,000 died, a casualty rate nearly 40% higher than that of white troops. A significant portion of these deaths could not be attributed to combat or disease, but were simply listed as missing, a designation that concealed their actual fate as captured soldiers who never returned. As Abraham Lincoln had observed in his second inaugural address just weeks before his assassination, "If God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. For the black soldiers who fought in the Civil War, their blood had indeed repaid that debt, not just on the battlefield, but in the unmarked graves behind Confederate lines where captured men disappeared without record. Their sacrifice, deliberately obscured in official accounts, represented the final, terrible cost of a system that had denied their very humanity. As winter turned to spring in 1865, with Union forces closing in on Richmond and Confederate leaders destroying evidence of their most damning policies, the men of the United States colored troops continued to fight, knowing surrender was not an option available to them. Their courage, in the face of this knowledge, stands as perhaps the most profound testament to their belief in the cause of freedom. Today, military historians continue to piece together fragments of evidence about the fate of these missing soldiers. Pension records reveal thousands of black veterans' families who never received benefits because their loved ones were listed as missing rather than killed in action or died in captivity. Each represents a story deliberately erased from the official narrative of the war. A Confederate officer who requested anonymity when interviewed by a Northern journalist in 1870 perhaps summarized the unspoken policy most clearly. We could not acknowledge Negro troops as legitimate prisoners without undermining the very foundation of our society. What happened to them was regrettable but inevitable given the nature of our conflict. The last documented case occurred just days before Lee's surrender. 7 men of the 41st United States Colored Infantry, separated from their unit near Farmville, Virginia, were captured by retreating Confederate cavalry on April 7, 1865. None ever appeared on prisoner rolls. Their fate remained unknown until 1940, when construction workers uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of 7 men in Union uniform, each with wrists bound and evidence of execution-style gunshot wounds. But the truth they carried to unmarked graves echoes in the words Frederick Douglass wrote in 1863. Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. For thousands of these men, that right was paid for not just with service, but with the terrible knowledge of what awaited them if captured. Until today, no comprehensive accounting of these lost soldiers has been completed. Their story remains buried in fragmented records, intentional omissions, and the systematic destruction of evidence. To this day, historians continue to debate exactly how many black Union soldiers disappeared after capture. What remains undeniable is that when the 25th Army Corps, composed entirely of United States colored troops, marched into Richmond on April 3, 1865, they were not just liberating the Confederate capital, they were avenging thousands of comrades who had vanished into a shadowy system the Confederacy would never officially acknowledge. The brass buttons on their blue uniforms caught the spring sunlight as they marched past the empty offices where the policy of their destruction had been crafted. The eagle insignia on their caps faced forward as they moved through streets where, just days before, their capture would have meant not prisoner status, but a death sentence. Their very presence in those streets, bearing arms and wearing the uniform of the United States Army, represented the final repudiation of everything the Confederacy had fought to preserve. As one soldier of the 25th Corps reportedly said upon entering Richmond, "This day makes it worth everything." What he did not say, what did not need saying among men who understood, was that everything included the thousands of comrades who had disappeared into the darkness of Confederate captivity, men whose fate would be deliberately obscured in the reconciliation narratives of the decades to come. The sound of their footsteps on Richmond's cobblestone streets echoed a truth the defeated Confederacy would never admit. that in denying the humanity of captured black soldiers, they had revealed the fundamental inhumanity of their cause. That in attempting to erase these men from the record of war, they had instead ensured that their absence would speak more powerfully than any presence could. To this day, that absence echoes through the archives, in missing names on prisoner rolls, in pension applications denied for lack of death certificates, in the statistical impossibilities of combat reports compared to casualty figures. It echoes in the words, "missing in action," that appear with disproportionate frequency beside the names of black regiments in the final accounting of the war. Until today, no Confederate document has ever been found explicitly ordering the execution or enslavement of captured black troops. The policy existed in deliberate omission, in coded language, in the gap between written records and actual practice. It existed in the terrible knowledge carried by every black soldier who fixed bayonet and advanced toward enemy lines, understanding that for him there could be no surrender. The sound that still echoes from 1865 is not that of documentation, but of silence. The silence of records never kept, of fates deliberately unrecorded, of men who disappeared into the space between official history and terrible truth. It is the silence that was finally broken when the boots of the 25th Corps echoed through the streets of Richmond, a sound that said what the Confederacy would never admit, that the men wearing the U.S. on their uniform buttons were soldiers, were citizens, were men whose humanity could no longer be denied. In 1878, former Confederate General John Bell Hood published his memoirs, Advance and Retreat, carefully omitting any discussion of captured black troops. When specifically questioned by a reporter from the New York Tribune about the disparity in prisoner exchange rates between white and black Union soldiers, Hood replied only that wartime necessities created many regrettable circumstances which gentlemen need not revisit. The general's papers, however, included a letter from a subordinate officer dated March 1865 requesting guidance on the Negro prisoner question, a letter Hood never answered in writing. The War Department files contained testimony from Corporal Elijah Jones of the 55th Massachusetts, one of the few black soldiers to escape Confederate captivity. Interviewed in Washington in May 1865, Jones described being captured near Charleston with 17 other men from his regiment. We were immediately separated from the white prisoners and marched to a separate holding area. That night, officers came and selected 10 men, including myself, for labor details. We were marched away, but I managed to slip into a drainage ditch during heavy rain. The other 9 never returned. Jones's testimony was taken under oath but classified until 1912. By April 1865, as news of Lee's surrender spread, black soldiers throughout the Union Army celebrated not just victory, but survival. For many, reaching the war's end meant escaping the fate they had seen befall captured comrades. Sergeant Thomas Wilson of the 118th United States Colored Infantry wrote in his journal on April 10th, "News of General Lee's surrender reached us today. The men wept openly, not just for the victory, but for those who never had the chance to see this day. We all know why so many are missing." Captain Robert Hamilton, a white officer commanding a company in the 22nd United States Colored Infantry, submitted a report to the War Department on April 25, 1865, documenting the return of prisoners from Confederate camps. Of the 37 men from my company listed as captured over the past year, not one has been returned through prisoner exchange. Every white soldier captured from neighboring regiments during the same engagements has either been exchanged or his death in captivity officially recorded. Hamilton requested a formal inquiry, but his report was filed without action. The Confederate policy regarding captured black troops became one of the first casualties of post-war reconciliation. When federal investigators attempted to gather evidence for potential war crimes trials in 1865, they found systematic gaps in Confederate records. Prison camp registers contained detailed entries for white captives, but rarely mentioned black soldiers captured in the same engagements. Military courts established to investigate wartime atrocities were disbanded by 1866 as President Johnson pursued a policy of rapid reunification with former Confederate states. Josiah Wilson, who served as a clerk in the Confederate War Department until Richmond's fall, later provided sworn testimony to a congressional committee. I was personally instructed to maintain separate record books for colored captives. These books were among the first items burned when evacuation was ordered. I specifically recall being told by Secretary Seddon that such records should never fall into federal hands. Wilson's testimony was taken in 1867, but sealed when Reconstruction policies shifted toward reconciliation rather than accountability. The Union Army's own records inadvertently helped conceal the truth. Black soldiers who disappeared after capture were typically listed as missing in action rather than prisoner of war or killed in action. This administrative classification meant that their fates remained officially unresolved, their stories untold. Pension applications filed by widows of missing black soldiers were frequently denied due to insufficient evidence of death, creating financial hardship that compounded the personal loss. Chaplain Henry Turner of the 1st United States Colored Infantry recorded in his wartime diary a conversation with a Confederate chaplain during a brief truce in March 1865. "I inquired about our men captured last month," Turner wrote, and he replied with uncomfortable candor, "Your colored troops are not acknowledged as legitimate prisoners of war by our government. I suggest you not inquire further, as you will not welcome the answer." Turner's diary was donated to Howard University in 1911, but its contents were not widely published until decades later. The most revealing evidence came from Confederate prison guards themselves. Private James McPherson, who served at Andersonville Prison, wrote in a letter to his sister dated February 1865, "No colored troops are held here despite hundreds being captured in recent fighting." When I asked the commander about this, he said only that special procedures applied to such captives and changed the subject. "There are rumors among the guards that I dare not commit to paper." The letter was discovered among family papers in 1938, but its significance not recognized until historians began systematically investigating the fate of black prisoners. As federal forces occupied Richmond in April 1865, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Wallace of the Provost Marshal's office was tasked with securing Confederate government buildings. In the basement of the War Department, he discovered a room containing ankle shackles and restraints. His report noted, "Evidence suggests this facility was used for temporary detention of colored prisoners prior to their transportation elsewhere. No official records of such detentions have been located despite evidence of regular use. The facility did not appear on any official prison lists." Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood, who won the Medal of Honor serving with the 4th United States Colored Infantry, wrote in his memoirs completed in 1900, "Every man in colored regiments understood the consequences of capture. We fought with the knowledge that for us, surrender was not merely capture, but a death sentence. This understanding influenced our actions in every engagement, making retreat unthinkable and surrender impossible. It was never officially stated in orders, but every black soldier knew it as certainly as he knew his own name." The evidence collected by early historians was substantial but fragmented. Records deliberately destroyed, witnesses reluctant to speak, and a national desire to heal rather than revisit wartime atrocities all contributed to the systematic suppression of this aspect of Civil War history. When Colonel Samuel Livingston compiled the first comprehensive history of black troops in 1866, his manuscript included a chapter on prisoner treatment that his publisher insisted be removed before publication. Such accusations, however well documented, will only inflame tensions at a time when reconciliation is the national priority, the publisher wrote. Even Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist who had encouraged black men to enlist, found himself unable to secure a full accounting of missing soldiers. In an 1868 letter to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, Douglass wrote, "Families of colored soldiers still await word of men listed as missing who were known to have been captured. Their widows and orphans deserve both the truth and the benefits granted to other Union casualties." Stanton's reply acknowledged the problem, but cited inadequate documentation as preventing formal recognition of these men's fates. The policy that dared not speak its name appeared obliquely in Confederate correspondence. A letter from Secretary of War James Seddon to General Howell Cobb, dated January 28, 1865, referred to maintaining our established position regarding captured former slaves in federal uniform without explicitly stating what that position entailed. The carefully constructed ambiguity allowed Confederate leaders to implement a brutal policy while maintaining plausible deniability in official records. Colonel Samuel Wallace, appointed to investigate missing prisoner reports in July 1865, submitted his findings to the War Department with a frank assessment. The statistical evidence is irrefutable. While approximately 20% of white Union soldiers captured by Confederate forces died in captivity, more than 80% of captured black soldiers never returned alive. No explanation consistent with lawful prisoner treatment can account for this disparity. Wallace's report was filed without further action as the political winds shifted toward reconciliation. In private correspondence, even some Confederate officers expressed discomfort with the policy. Lieutenant Jonathan Fairbanks wrote to his father in February 1865, "What happens to the colored captives troubles my conscience, though few here will speak of it. These men wear federal uniforms and fight under the same flag as white soldiers, yet their treatment upon capture violates every standard of civilized warfare. I have witnessed things I hope to forget when this war ends." The letter remained in family possession until donated to historians in 1952. The disappearance of captured black soldiers represented not just individual tragedies, but a systematic attempt to preserve the racial hierarchy that had justified slavery. By refusing to acknowledge black men as legitimate soldiers deserving of prisoner of war protections, the Confederacy sought to maintain the fiction that African Americans were inherently subordinate, incapable of the courage and discipline that military service represented. The presence of black men in Union uniform fundamentally challenged this narrative, which is why their capture triggered such brutal responses. As Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who commanded the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, colored, wrote in his journal, "My men know that surrender means death. This knowledge does not deter them, but rather strengthens their resolve. They fight with the desperate courage of those for whom there is no alternative to victory." Higginson's observations, published after the war, offered one of the few contemporary acknowledgments of what black soldiers faced if captured. The historical evidence, scattered across archives, personal papers, and suppressed reports, points to a consistent, if unwritten, Confederate policy. Black soldiers in Union uniform were not to be treated as legitimate prisoners of war, but rather as insurrectionists or escaped slaves. This policy, implemented through deliberate omission from official records rather than explicit orders, allowed Confederate leaders to maintain plausible deniability while effectively condemning captured black soldiers to death or re-enslavement. The exact numbers will never be known. Military records indicate that approximately 13,000 black soldiers were listed as missing during the war, nearly 3 times the rate for white troops in comparable units. While some undoubtedly died in battle with their bodies never recovered, the statistical disparity strongly suggests that a significant number disappeared after capture, their fates deliberately obscured in Confederate records. As the nation moved toward reconciliation in the decades following the Civil War, this aspect of the conflict was systematically minimized in official histories. The narrative of brother against brother, fighting honorably and then reconciling, could not accommodate the systematic mistreatment of black prisoners. Just as the war's fundamental connection to slavery was downplayed in favor of emphasis on states' rights and constitutional disagreements, the Confederate refusal to recognize black soldiers as legitimate prisoners was obscured in the interest of national healing. The men who disappeared into this shadowy system left behind families who never received closure or compensation. Pension records reveal thousands of applications from widows of missing black soldiers that were denied due to lack of death certificates or prisoner records. Mary Johnson, whose husband served with the 29th Connecticut, colored, wrote in her 1867 pension application, "My husband William was captured near Petersburg in March 1865. No record of his imprisonment exists, nor has any notice of his death been received, yet he has not returned. I am left to support our children without acknowledgement of his sacrifice." Her application was denied. When the 25th Army Corps entered Petersburg on April 3, 1865, the men marched with fixed bayonets and determined expressions. A white officer described them as advancing with the grim resolve of those who had not merely patriotism, but personal vengeance to motivate them. They had seen too many comrades disappear after capture to show mercy toward a defeated enemy. Yet military discipline prevailed. There were no documented reprisals against Confederate prisoners, despite the knowledge of how their own captured comrades had been treated. The systematic suppression of this history began almost immediately after the war's end, when Colonel Samuel Thompson attempted to document the fates of missing black soldiers in August 1865. He found that Confederate prison records had been destroyed, witnesses were reluctant to testify, and his own superiors showed little interest in pursuing the investigation. "There appears to be a general desire to leave certain aspects of this war unexamined," he wrote in his final report, which was filed away without action or publication. The testimony that did survive came largely from escaped prisoners like Sergeant James Freeman of the 54th Massachusetts, who provided a sworn statement in July 1865. "After capture near Olustee, Florida, I was separated from white prisoners and informed I would be returned to my rightful owner. When I explained I had been born free in Massachusetts, the officer said that made no difference under Confederate law. That night, I and 7 others were moved under heavy guard. During the transfer, I managed to escape into a swamp. I never saw the other men again." Freeman's testimony was taken, but no investigation followed. The last official attempt to document this aspect of the war came in 1870, when Congressman Benjamin Butler proposed a congressional investigation into the treatment of black prisoners. The measure was defeated, with opponents arguing that reopening such wounds serves no purpose in our reunited nation. Butler's personal papers, preserved at the Library of Congress, include documentation he had gathered from military records and survivor testimonies, evidence that would remain largely unexamined by historians for decades. As the black veterans of the Civil War aged, they carried their memories and knowledge with them, rarely finding audiences willing to hear the full truth of their experiences. When Sergeant Major Lewis Douglas, son of Frederick Douglass, spoke to a gathering of the Grand Army of the Republic in 1880, his reference to the fate of captured comrades was omitted from newspaper accounts of the speech. The nation had chosen reconciliation over reckoning, unity over accountability. The final irony came in the early 20th century, when monuments to Confederate leaders were erected across the South, casting them as honorable men who had fought for principle rather than to preserve slavery. The same generals who had overseen a system that refused to recognize black soldiers as legitimate prisoners were memorialized as paragons of military virtue and Southern chivalry. The systematic mistreatment of captured black troops remained an uncomfortable footnote, acknowledged in academic histories, but absent from public commemoration. Today, military historians continue to piece together this fragmented history from surviving records, personal papers, statistical analyses, and the precious few first-hand accounts that were preserved. What emerges is a consistent pattern, too widespread to be dismissed as isolated incidents. The Confederate military and government implemented an unwritten but systematic policy of refusing to treat captured black soldiers as legitimate prisoners of war, instead subjecting them to execution, re-enslavement, or lethal neglect. This policy, deliberately obscured in official records but revealed through statistical evidence and surviving testimony, represents one of the Civil War's darkest chapters, a final, desperate attempt to preserve the racial hierarchy that the conflict would ultimately destroy. The black soldiers who served, knowing the risks of capture, displayed a courage beyond what was asked of their white comrades, fighting with the knowledge that for them there could be no surrender, no white flag, no honorable captivity. Their sacrifice, deliberately erased from official Confederate records and minimized in post-war reconciliation narratives, stands as testimony to their belief in the cause of freedom and their own humanity, a belief for which thousands paid the ultimate price, not on the battlefield, but in the shadowy spaces where prisoners disappeared and records fell silent. The brass buttons bearing the letters US, the eagle insignia, the blue uniforms that should have guaranteed them the protections due to all captured soldiers, these became not shields but targets, marking them for special treatment, for the Confederacy's final, desperate assertion that black men must not be acknowledged as soldiers, as equals, as men deserving the same treatment as their white comrades in arms. In this refusal lay the fundamental contradiction of the Confederate cause, a society so dependent on racial hierarchy that it could not acknowledge the humanity of black men even when they stood as soldiers on the battlefield. The policy regarding captured black troops revealed the true nature of the conflict more clearly than any political proclamation or constitutional argument. A war fought ultimately not over abstract principles of states' rights, but over the concrete reality of human bondage and the racial order it maintained. The men of the 25th Corps who marched into Richmond on April 3, 1865, carried this knowledge with them. Their presence in the Confederate capital, armed and in uniform, represented not just military victory, but the fundamental repudiation of the principle that had denied their humanity and condemned their captured comrades to unrecorded fates. Their footsteps echoing on Richmond's streets spoke what Confederate records had deliberately silenced, that they were soldiers, were citizens, were men whose humanity could no longer be denied. As Frederick Douglass had prophetically written, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter, US. Let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." For thousands of black soldiers who disappeared into the silence of Confederate captivity, that right was purchased at the highest possible price, a price deliberately obscured in the records of the defeated Confederacy and the reconciliation narratives that followed. Their story, pieced together from fragments of evidence that survived deliberate destruction and systematic suppression, stands as testament to both the darkest aspects of American history and the courage of those who faced that darkness, knowing what awaited them if captured. In their sacrifice, deliberately unrecorded by their captors, lies a truth about the Civil War that the Confederacy could never admit, that in their desperate attempt to deny the humanity of black soldiers, they revealed the fundamental inhumanity of their cause. Today, military historians estimate that between 7,000 and 10,000 black Union soldiers disappeared after capture during the Civil War. Their names appear on regimental rosters and casualty lists as missing in action, their fates unrecorded in official Confederate documents. But in the statistical impossibility of their disappearance, in the fragments of testimony that survived, in the desperate efforts to destroy evidence of their treatment, their story can still be heard, a story the Confederacy never admitted, but history can no longer deny. As the men of the United States colored troops who survived the war gathered in the decades that followed, they would sometimes speak among themselves of comrades who had disappeared, of the knowledge they all carried into battle. "We fought differently," one veteran recalled at a reunion in 1885, knowing there was no retreat, no surrender, only victory or death. Every colored soldier understood what capture meant, though it was never written in our orders. This shared understanding passed down through generations of families and finally into the historical record, stands as the final testimony to what the Confederacy would never put in writing, but implemented with terrible efficiency. In the spring sunshine of April 1865, as the war finally ended, the brass buttons on the uniforms of black Union soldiers reflected more than just light. They reflected a truth that had been purchased with the blood of thousands of their comrades who had disappeared into unrecorded captivity. A truth that would echo long after the sounds of battle faded, that in their service and sacrifice they had established beyond denial their right to be recognized not just as soldiers, but as citizens, as men whose humanity no power on earth could ever again deny.